Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final event of Words and Music 2020, Remembering Tom Dent. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and thank you especially for tuning in during the Saints game, Who Dat. We're so excited to end today with Remembering Tom Dent. As you all know, New Orleans Griot, the Tom Dent Reader, has been the focus of One Book, One New Orleans literacy initiatives and free community programming throughout 2020. So I feel like I've spent a year immersed in Tom Dent's work and have been so inspired, but I haven't really gotten a chance to learn who he was as a man, right? Sometimes the man is very different than the works. And so this idea for this conversation came about very organically. Basically, what happened was a few months back, I started noticing when we would post about Tom Dent and post the quotes and post the videos from our Griot Work series, which can be found on our YouTube channel, that someone named Lindsay Dent kept liking and sharing. And I finally just reached out to her and I said, hey, are you one of those Dents? And it turned out she was. Turned out she was Tom Dent's niece. And so then Lindsay introduced us to her dad, Ben Dent, and this just sort of came about. I know Ben has been tuning in as we've been doing these online things, and I got to thinking about that more as we were preparing for this virtual festival, because part of the challenge of a virtual festival is to embrace possibilities that would not have been possible in a live space. And one of the things that I have found really beautiful throughout 2020, throughout this virtual programming that One Book, One New Orleans had been doing, was the fact that Ben from all the way in California could tune in and he could see us pay tribute to his brother. And so I asked Ben and Lindsay, hey, would you guys want to close us out with talking about him as a family member? And then Dr. Jerry Ward and Kalamu Salaam, who are good friends of his, said, yes, we'd like to talk about him as a friend. So we're here to talk about Tom Dent as a son, as an uncle, as a brother, as a friend, which seems like a really fitting way to close out a year when we've all realized how close we are to our families and how much those people really do matter. So here to talk a little bit about his brother. We'll bring up everybody else afterwards, but he deserves his own space. Ben Dent, y'all. Welcome to the stage.
Hi. Yes, I'm Tom Dent's brother, believe it or not. First of all, Tom and I were very different people. Tom was 4 years older than I was. And so, that's a lot when you're 5 or 10 years old. He had his own bedroom. My bedroom was with my other brother, Walter. Also, Tom went away to school when I was like 11, and we never lived in the same city after that. Tom went away to school, etc. So I saw him only on holidays or when I returned to New Orleans to visit my parents or to get some oysters, because New Orleans oysters are like no other place that I know of. Anyway, also, I was always interested in a career. I think I got it from my father, that you had to have a job and you had to work and make money. And so I look forward to doing that. Tom wasn't about the money at all. He wanted to do something important. He didn't consider that money was a part of it. I'll tell you one story. Once upon a time, Tom asked me if we, the three boys, would pay to have a lady from Amistad, Frances Borders, do a oral history interview with my mother to get some stuff written down. And I said, sure, that sounds good. How much are you talking about? And he said, see, you're always interested in the money part. I said, no, it's not that I'm saying no. You asked me to pay for this thing. can you at least tell me about how much money you're talking about? Anyway, that was Tom. The money part, he never thought about. Sometimes we used to joke about whether he could make a living or not. But sometimes he worked. Sometimes he had a job and made money. Other times he would do what he thought was important, and it didn't matter to him whether he made any money or not. Tom was interested in the fine arts. I'm a computer person. I started that from school. And so we're different that way too. I have another story for you. Once upon a time, Tom said, I want to talk about something, but you have to promise not to ever tell anybody else. Okay, what's that? He said, well, people have been bugging me saying I need to get a word processor to work with, because I've been working with my fountain pen or a typewriter, and I send it off to somebody and they do some editing and send it back. And then we start all over again, which leads to a lot of rekeying mistakes. And by that time, I was already working with something that I called a word processor. So, and the main advantage was that you didn't have to rekey everything. You just make changes when you wanted to, and just change the parts that you wanted to change. Anyway, I said, okay, I'll help you look for computers. And we went to Best Buy, I think it was in Metairie. And they had a long row where everything that had anything to do with a computer was in that long row. And we started out in the middle, and I kind of, I was very interested in having something that had memory, because after all, if you can't have memory, something you could store what you type on it, then you can't just go back and make changes. And Tom was kind of more interested in something smaller. And my wife was there, and she commented that we started in the middle, and I drifted to the right where machines were more complicated, and Tom drifted to the left where machines were much less complicated, and they weren't really computers at all. It was just something with a screen, like a typewriter with a screen. He wanted something that was portable, he could carry around. I was into that too, but it had to have memory. Anyway, after about 20 minutes of us diverging on what we might be interested in, Tom said, well, let's stop and go have coffee. We need to talk about this. So we went to have coffee, and Tom said, I don't want anything that complicated. And, he ended up reverting to his typewriter and his fountain pens. He loved fountain pens in him. Just another difference between Tom and I. I bonded with Tom through tennis, really. I remember that when I was really maybe 7 or 8 years old, watching Tom take tennis lessons. Somebody would hit tennis balls at him and tell him what he was doing wrong. I also remember trips that we would take during the summer to visit my grandparents in Houston. And on the way, Tom was very interested in seeing whether we could get Wimbledon on the radio. I didn't know what Wimbledon was. And we actually found it on the radio, crackling as we drove between cities. And I could kind of imagine the game from an announcement with no video, just all audio stuff. And every time I came to New Orleans for holidays or whatever, Tom would say, bring your tennis racket. And we would play tennis. We had to play doubles because I was kind of a John McEnroe emotional state. So I was slamming rackets and cursing and everything. And that didn't work very well. So Tom said, well, if we play together, at least you won't be mad at me when somebody. So we would play doubles someplace. And I met many of Tom's friends playing doubles. After he died, I decided that, although a lot of people knew Tom as a writer and as a poet, that through the Jazz Fest that not a lot of people knew about is tennis. And I wanted people to know about that aspect of it. So with the help of Joan Rhodes and my brother Walter, we actually started a Tom Dent tennis tournament. And we did that for about 12 years. And I got to meet a lot of good friends that way. Met Lloyd Dillon, who was a tennis coach at Atkins and Stern Tennis Center. And he was the one that did most of the work. But we'd have a tennis tournament every year and like that. And I finally gave it up, but because I had hoped that it would take a life of its own, but it didn't. It just weren't good enough. One of Tom's characteristics was that he liked to introduce people to his friends. I've heard Chakula talk about that, but he introduced me to a lot of people. Whenever I was in town, he would invite me to join him in whatever he was doing that evening. And I have a list here of people he introduced me to. They're not in any particular order, and I know I'm going to leave some people out, so I apologize ahead of time for that. But the first one I remember was Dave Brubeck. He introduced me to Brubeck's music, and I actually met Brubeck a couple of times, and I was crazy about his music, and I still am. I guess I'm stuck there. He introduced me to Danny Barker. He introduced me to Terence Blanchard. I knew Terence Blanchard did the scores for Spike Lee's movies, but recently I Googled it, and it's like 43 movies that he did scores for. So he's a very important musician there. He introduced me to Dirty Dozen's brass band. Tom did liner notes for one of the Dirty Dozen CDs. He introduced me to Michael White, who I think was on another program earlier in this series. Kim Lacey Rogers, rather. He introduced me to. She was in town once, and she wrote a very important book about the civil rights movement and the various phases of it that I found extremely interesting. She introduced me to Jerry Ward, who's going to be on screen here in a few minutes. Kalamu, Chakula, Brenda Marie Osby, Lolis Edward Eli, and Ellis Marsalis. They were actually classmates of Tom's in high school. And then Lolis Eric Eli, who's I think may have been part of this too. At least I hear he's in New Orleans around now. Dr. Henry Lacey was somebody that we played tennis with. Nehemiah Atkinson, if you don't know who he is, Google him. He won tennis championships in Australia when he was over 80 years old. He was winning tennis tournaments in the over 80 category. Joanne Clevenger at the upper line, questionably the best restaurant in New Orleans. If you haven't tried it, you should try it. It's expensive, but it's worth trying. I already mentioned Florence Borders and her son Jimmy Borders, and a lot of other people that I know in New Orleans. I'm very happy that events like this are preserving Tom's legacy, and I'd like to thank all the participants, I can't name them all, that did work for it. Back to you, Megan.
Wow, thank you so much for that amazing way to get us kicked off. All right, now I would like to welcome to the stage Lindsay Dent, who is Ben's daughter and Tom Dent's niece. Welcome, Lindsay.
Hello.
We'd like to welcome to the stage Dr. Jerry Ward, who wrote the afterword for New Orleans Griot, a Tom Dent Reader. And we'd like to welcome to the stage Kalamu Salaam, who, among many things, edited New Orleans Griot, the Tom Dent Reader. Thank you guys so much for being here on this beautiful Sunday. We really appreciate you. So I'm going to start off asking things based on some of the things that I just heard Ben bring up. And what was really interesting is when you were talking about typing and having to go back and rekey and, you know, the beauty of the typewriter versus the word processor. By the way, I much would prefer a fountain pen over anything else. So I'm right there with Tom Dent on that. I started to think, oh, well, what happened to all those discarded versions that had to be rekeyed? Like, where'd they go? Did he throw them in the trash? Did he save them? And so I was wondering, for Kalamu and Dr. Ward, do you guys know if those discarded manuscripts made it into the archives or if they're just kind of gone?
Well, I know a lot of stuff made it into the archives, and Kalamu's been the one who was crawling through the stuff at Amistad, so maybe he should go next.
Oh, I think you're muted, Baba Kalamu. Oh, no. All right, he is having a little sound issue. When you get it fixed, don't worry. The question about Tom Dent's archives will be there. This is the beauty of being live and unfiltered in 2020, right? Sometimes the technology cooperates. Sometimes we have to roll with it. Which honestly, I think is really cool, thinking about you and your brother and how one of you was so technology oriented and one of you was so not that way, because we've really sort of seen in 2020 how those things kind of mirror each other and can like complement and complicate each other. So Lindsay, I wanted to ask you, you were little when Tom Dent's career was already established. Like, when you were growing up, because I think of celebrities' kids, right, who say, oh, that's just mom. No, it doesn't matter. No, sure, yeah, that's John Lennon, but that's dad. So, Lindsay, did you know when you were growing up that Tom Dent was Tom Dent? And like, what are your memories of him?
Well, Uncle Tommy was Uncle Tommy. And as Dad had mentioned, that we didn't live in the same state or in the same area, and so we didn't see him that often. But we would go down often to New Orleans. And what I remember the most is things like sliding down the banister at the president's house at Dillard University, or playing in the water fountain in the back patio of my grandparents' house, the president and first lady, the former president and first lady of Dillard, and scaring their turtles. Those are the things that I remember, and Laura too. And then when Uncle Tommy would come along, he would show up, late to wherever we were. We couldn't really pin him down. So he had that kind of celebrity status, he came when he could, and we appreciated that, and we loved to see him, and we watched him go, and we had no idea what he was doing. And then what happened was we would start to get things like this in the mail, his, Blue Lights and River songs, and then we would get Magnolia Street, that would come up. And then we heard all about Southern Journey for a long time. We heard about that for a long time. And then, of course, the Tom Dent Reader that we're working on right now. But so many of these things we heard about, but we didn't really understand. And then as I got a little bit older, I was a musician, and I started to hear, or maybe I had heard it before but didn't remember, the stories of some of the people who Tom knew, and the Marsalises, and the jazz greats that Dad was referring to, and I just thought that was so cool. So again, the celebrity status, right? And I remember one time that I was going to surprise my grandmother for her birthday. I don't remember which birthday it was. I think I was 14 years old, and my parents put me on a plane, and I went down. Uncle Tommy picked me up. He had I thought it was a blue BMW. Dad thought it was a red one. I don't know if any of you know. But he picked me up in his BMW, and I thought, man, Uncle Tommy is so cool. Because for some reason, I was into cars. As a teenager, I was really into cars, and I thought that was so cool because I did not know anybody who owned a BMW. It was an old, very old car that Dad might have mentioned, and maybe it shouldn't have been public, that he was really trying to keep together this car. But I just thought he was so cool, and he dropped me off, and that was really cool of him to do as well. But I just remember him having that kind of celebrity status. But I really didn't know, about his work or enough about it. Let's just say it that way. Really until now, and this is one of the things that you were mentioning, Megan, about the, maybe the pros and the cons of the differences between those who are, digitally connected and those who weren't. Believe it or not, I'm one of those people that I would, prefer the typewriter and the fountain pen. I always have been. And there's my dad and sister who are, been computer science masters their whole lives and fight with me on a regular basis. So I feel like I might have inherited that portion from Uncle Tommy. But anyway, those are kind of my memories as far as that goes.
So for Dr. Ward and Baba Kalamu, do you guys remember the car that she's talking about? I saw you guys smiling when she was describing that car.
Oh, I don't remember it being blue or red. I thought it was rather gray. But that might have been a later car that he had.
Yeah, it could have been more than one, too, that he had. I don't know. That would be really cool. But
yeah, that's really okay. So all of you guys who are researchers out there, this is a call to you. What color was Tom Dent's car? If you guys can find that out and have a definitive answer with evidence, you will win some sort of prize. I don't know what it is because I just came up with this. But we'll give you something if you can figure out what color Tom Dent's car was. Baba Kalamu, how's that sound working for you now? Are you good? Still maybe not so much. We will figure it out. It's okay. Sometimes it takes 2 or 3 times, right? I'm sure just like with Tom Dent and the typewriter, it took 2 or 3 times with that word processor before he got it down. And sometimes that's what happens with technology. But it's really cool that you mentioned all the musicians he knew, because Dave Brubeck actually appears in a whole essay in the book, right? So does Danny Barker. He appears, the Marcelluses, all these folks that you're mentioning appear in the book. What I thought was really cool, too, when Ben was talking, was that he mentioned that he and his brother are 4 years apart. Because that got me to thinking about my relationship with my little sister. I'm 4 years older than she is as well. And we've not lived in the same city since she was 14 years old. We're still pretty tight. But we have very different memories of people in our family because those 4 years made a difference. So I think one of my favorite passages in the Reader is that passage on page 91, for those of you who can follow along at home. Page 91 of the updated edition with the One Book logo on the cover. And he's talking about your grandmother, who apparently he adored. He says, I can identify with my grandmother, with her poverty, but mostly I would say with her attitude toward life. I loved her ungrammaticalisms, but she read the newspaper and kept her mind alert until the day she died. She read everything I ever wrote. her mind never died. And so my question to you, Ben, is do you have similar memories of that grandmother? How do you remember her? Oh, don't forget to unmute.
Thanks. I don't have many memories of her. I think you're talking about my father's mother, who lived in Atlanta. She came every once in a while, and we saw her there. But of course, I never lived in Atlanta. Tom went to school there, and so he spent a lot more time with her because they were in the same city. Also, I think I get this right. After Tom was born, my mother went back to school at Oberlin to get a master's degree. And she took Tom with her and the grandmother you're talking about, my father's mother. We called her Gran, so I think her name was Daisy. So he spent a lot of time with her when he was very young. And of course, I wasn't even born then. So, he just had a lot more contact with her. I know that she came from extreme poverty, and my father kind of worked his way up from nothing. So anyway, there was certainly that kind of thing. I didn't know that when she's talking about when he talked about her reading everything that he wrote, he must be talking about work that he did while he was in school at Morehouse. He was the editor of the college newspaper, which I think was called the Maroon Tiger. And I know that he wrote regularly. He really became a writer there, or it became clear that he was going to be a writer there. And so he wrote stuff in the Maroon Tiger. I never saw a copy of the Maroon Tiger. So, we're just very different.
I wanted to touch on something else that Ben had said, and this is a question for his friends. Ben said, Tom introduced me to everybody. He loved to take me around and introduce me to people. And I'm getting a feeling that this is something he did not just with his little brother, but with his friends as well. So I was wondering if maybe Dr. Ward and Baba Kalamu could talk a little bit about some of the people that Tom Dent introduced them to and their impact on their lives and work.
Okay, I'll start off. Tom introduced me to many of the people who became my friends here in the city of New Orleans after 1973, because Tom and I had a 25-year friendship, which was a very strong friendship. And I met Kalamu Salaam through him, Corvallis Jexbro and her husband Raymond, Jakula, Lola's Edward Eli, and his son Lola's Eric Eli, and many more people that I'll even not try to do a catalog of. That was one of Tom's strengths, that he had this not magic touch, but he had a sense that people of like minds should be connected, and if they worked out in terms of collaboration or friendships or whatever, that was good. This is very important because one of the things that I wrote in the afterword for the Tom Dent Reader was about Tom's sense of history, which certainly involved people, not just events, but people. And if you will indulge me, I want to just read a very brief little paragraph from that, which I think is important in understanding Tom and the kind of human being he was. In he wrote a very interesting editorial for the magazine in Kumbo in 1969. And this is what I had to say about that editorial. And by the way, Ben, Tom gave me a bound copy of the issues of Maroon Tiger for which he was an editor. Your father had it beautifully bound for him. So it will be in the Amistad eventually, so you'll be able to access it and finally read it. But the paragraph is, these are the words, I'm referring to Tom's writing, these are the words of a writer who knew history and change in quite intimate ways, who wanted to share his vision. These are the words of a writer whose insight can still benefit people in the 21st century who are having a deadly love affair with the fantasy of the post-racial and who may not take to heart what Esther Phillips was singing in Disposable Society and the Performance is Over, what Curtis Mayfield was preaching in The Underground, what Roberta Flack was truth-telling in Compared to What. In the final pages of The Free Southern Theater by the Free Southern Theater, Dent was uncanny and historically accurate. People do not need culture delivered in acts of benevolence that ignore the conditions of their community location. So I'd like for Kalamu to respond to that if he's got.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we
Okay,
can.
we got it. I think that the singular importance of Tom Dent is not who he knew, but whom he introduced to the people he knew. And that is significant. It is significant that one person would have a sense, as to quote my friend Jerry Ward, a sense of history so much that you would make sure that other people shared in what you found, shared in what you knew, and shared with you the sense of discovery, wanting to find out more. For me, there are two people that exemplify that, one of whom is probably unknown to many people. The first is Danny Barker. Danny Barker was a major musician here in New Orleans. And Danny Barker, once Tom introduced me to him and I got to know Danny and would sit in his front room and then eventually in his kitchen and then be introduced to the back room he had. Danny Barker, one way to identify him, not only as a musician and a storyteller, but also a historian. And I will never forget going into being led into Danny's back room and looking at all of the things he had back there. And there were a big pair of shoes. My shoe size is 13, but they were bigger than mine. And I looked on the shelf and I kind of pointed to the shoes and said, why is this here? At the time, I'm young enough to think that the archives would have books and recordings, but not shoes. And Danny laughed at me and told me, oh, those are Bojangles shoes. I said, oh. And at that moment, I realized just how uninformed and young I was. But here was a man who actually had Bojangles shoes sitting on a shelf in his backyard, in his back room, rather. And that was through Tom that I was introduced to that man, Danny Barker, and got to know Danny Barker as more than just a musician, I got to know him also as a historian and found out, Megan, you were speaking about writing, found out that Danny wrote vociferously and wrote short stories about growing up in New Orleans, had a journal and what have you. It was amazing. The other person I want to mention is I got to know him in West Point, Mississippi. West Point, Mississippi is one of those places that is, Mississippi has so many strange names. I don't know if you've ever driven through the Delta, Paris, Mississippi, Texas, Mississippi, Midnight, Mississippi, so forth, and Cleveland, Mississippi. I mean, these are real places. I see Professor Ward is smiling. You had some friends in Cleveland or Paris. I know you worked at Tougaloo for a while. So in any case, I used to ride with Tom for a short time period, he was teaching at West Point. West Point is located on the northeast corner, literal corner of Mississippi, but it's called West Point. And it took me years before I figured out why in the world would some place located in the northeast of Mississippi be called West Point. And that was because West Point was the end of one of the short extensions of the railroad that went through the South. And it was on the western end of that particular stretch of tracks. And it just so happens that it went from, if I'm not mistaken, from the East Coast through all the way through Alabama and ended up right there on the northeast corner of Mississippi. In any case, we'd go up there, and one of the people Tom introduced to me was John Buffington. The importance of John Buffington is that he was one of the many SNCC workers, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that worked in part of the Civil Rights Movement, and many of whom Tom visited when he did the book Southern Journey. But John was one of those many, many civil rights workers of SNCC who not only were the vanguard of the civil rights movement, but also many of them made a vow that what they would do is not only work, but actually live in the South, unlike some of the other civil rights people. So even to this day, you can go through parts of Mississippi and some of the people you will find there are former SNCC workers. And John Buffington, when I met John Buffington, John was idiosyncratic. He had his own ways about him. But one of the things he used to tell me stories and take me places. And we saw a field in Mississippi and a man on a tractor riding around. That man turned out to be Ralph Featherstone, who was killed in a bombing that happened when the bomb went off in a car he was in. We never knew all of the particulars, but that was Ralph Featherstone. And many other people that were introduced to me helped me to understand the reach of the civil rights movement. So I did not see the civil rights movement solely in terms of a television event, nor solely in terms of a big city event. I was born and reared here in New Orleans and was active in the civil rights movement here in New Orleans. But I also learned it as a rural event, and that many of the people who worked in those rural communities had made lifelong commitments to those communities. And that's significant because many people assume that being a writer is simply an intellectual activity and has no real connection to people's lives. And Tom disabused me of that notion. quickly.
Beautiful. That's really beautiful.
And it was through
Thank you.
Tom, individuals, but actually and walk with them through their backyards and what have you, be introduced to various things.
Thank you so much for that. That was beautiful. And with the John Buffington reference, it brought back to mind a poem that's in the reader itself, which is Mississippi Mornings for John Buffington. So you guys read that poem if you haven't. It's incredible, all of you watching. Speaking of those of you watching, I really love for this to be an interactive conversation. So if you've got questions or comments, drop them here in your comments section on Facebook and YouTube. We can see those and we can answer them so that this becomes a conversation between everyone across the country and not just us 5 people in this chat boxes. But that being said, until I see a question from y'all, I'll keep going with what I've got. So I wanted to think about something that you said in the reader, Baba Kalamu. I think it's in the introduction. And it brings a question I'd like to pose to each of you guys. I think I'm just going to go in alphabetical order because the teacher in me says that's the way to do things, right? So we'll start with Ben Dent, move to Lindsay Dent, then Kalamu Ya Salaam, then Jerry Ward. So not only, yes, what you said, and I'm paraphrasing because I was flipping through the book and I couldn't find the exact passage in front of me. It's like a 400-page book, so forgive me. You said you inherited his driving gloves. And so when you drive, Tom Dent is literally still holding your hand. And I thought that was a really beautiful image. And so for you, the 4 of you, I wanted to ask, how is Tom Dent, after his passing, still holding your hand?
You want us to go in order?
Please.
For me, as I indicated before, it was kind of like tennis. You know, we played tennis at a lot of different places. And in revisiting those places and seeing more of what happened there, seeing and learning and getting to know the people better, Tom was still holding my hand that way. Also, I have to say again that I keep thinking back to the people that he introduced me to, and I wish that I had pursued those friendships or those introductions further, even if I just read the stuff or listened to the music that those people did. I think that's all I can say. I think Lindsay's next.
Yeah, I think for me that it's kind of going through the history lesson that I didn't pay attention to when I was younger. You know, we were living a little bit of it, you know, and learning what we learned, which may not have been the same version as we maybe should have learned, which is kind of a hot topic right now. But to have these documents and to go through this, to share it with my boyfriend, my partner, my life partner, and he's got 3 children who are interested in civil liberties and interested in civil rights and interested in Black history, and also journalism and theater. This is all just right on, you know, for them. So they're starting to be, you know, handed these items and be exposed to these items. And I just hope to pass it on in that way and share.
For me,
How about you?
yeah, for me, the example I give in the book is it's hard for me to beat that, because I didn't get the gloves directly from Tom. When Tom, the last illness, I visited Tom in the hospital on either a Sunday or a Monday, I forget which, because I was headed to Munich, Germany. And when I did the visit with Tom, I had the feeling, it was a strange feeling that he would not be here when I got back. I was going to be in Munich for about 2 weeks. And as it turns out, Tom made his transition while I was in Munich. And when I came back, the funeral had already happened and everything. And over the following years, I would go to where Tom, I had an office in the same place that Tom was domiciled for a while, and would visit those places and talk with people. And one way or another, I ended up with a pair of Tom's gloves. His hands were a little larger than mine, but I held on to those gloves. And over the years, when I would travel, specifically traveling north, I would wear those gloves for the weather, because I would be out and about. And I still have those gloves, even though I don't travel much anymore. And it's an amazing feeling to put on the gloves of Tom Dent when I go somewhere, or when I would go somewhere, and to get that feeling that Tom is guiding me. He's helping me see and understand things that I may have missed if I didn't have those gloves on. Jerry?
Yes, the physical connection that I still have with Tom is one of his fountain pens. His mother was kind enough to give that to me. She asked me what I want. I said, all I want is a fountain pen. Because I remember Tom talking about his fountain pens and how he loved fine fountain pens, fine paper, and fine something else. But Tom's being a part of my life, a very important part of my life, still exists in my mind, in my head. I can vividly recollect certain exchanges that we had over the years, certain arguments that we had over the years, and we still remained friends. So for me, it's a privilege that I have not only Tom, but several other people, but especially Tom, in my head, so that when I'm making certain decisions about not only what to write, but how to write it, I think that some of the things that he told me kick in.
So it looks like we have a question from one of our audience members. Marion Denise Moore asks, how do you see Tom Dent's multiple legacies extending into the future? Who carries the flame, and is it necessary for his virtual descendants to know his name and works? Wow, that's a big question.
I think this is Kalamu. I want to work backwards on that question, because the assumption is that we know people, and the people we know, we remember, and the other people, we just don't remember them, and and unless somebody reminds us, we don't even think about them. And I think what has happened with Tom is he touched so many people whom we don't even know. We don't really know personally the multitude of people that Tom touched. I can think of some of the people when he was in New York, and Tom would mention to me some people by name, an architect here, so just different people, and I had no idea who they were, but they were important to Tom, and Tom was important to them, and so Tom's life lives on in people we don't even know, and in some cases, the people themselves might not remember Tom specifically, but his influence lives on, and in that way, I think many more of us are touched by Tom, and the reason that there's a program such as this and other programs for Tom Dent, and no other New Orleans writer even equals that reach, has to do with the fact that Tom was a person who not only knew a lot of people, but as I said before, put people in touch with each other. And so as the African philosophy says, as long as a person is remembered, they're not deceased. Well, in this case, Tom is going to outlive all of us.
I thought of something I wish I'd said before. I said he introduced me to Danny Barker, but I only made it to the front room. But I came back many times to New Orleans, and I wish I'd said, Tom, take me over there again. I'd like to talk to this guy a little further and find out a little more about what he's done. And it was a lot more than his music. Yeah, I could look up some of his music or watch videos of him playing, but that's as far as I got. And I just missed the opportunity to know him. And I'm sure that, he would have been willing, having been introduced by Tom, he would have been willing to talk to me. And maybe I would have made it to the back room too.
I think we all want to know.
Okay.
Go ahead, Dr. Ward.
Megan, I just want to, I think I have to start at the end of the question because I have forgotten what the beginning was. But in terms of, is it necessary to know Tom Dent in our cyberspace or our, is it necessary for his virtual descendants to know his name and works? And I would say yes, in thunder. Yes, it is important to know that. It's important to know that because any writer of Tom's achievements should be talked about by those of us who consider ourselves to be literary historians and literary critics or theorists. There are so many people who fall through the crack because hotshot scholars decide, oh, that's old. Let me talk about the Afro future, which I don't know a damn thing about. And so you don't talk about Tom Dent. It's like saying, oh, we can talk about world theater without talking about Shakespeare. It's that serious. So yes, his works, Kalamu has done a magnificent job with the book. If you look in the book, you will see that I made my contributions before Tom's death in terms of a bibliography of his work. And there were several interviews that I did with him. And I'm not going to forget him. I'm not going to forget him. I'm not going to forget Stephen Henderson. I'm not going to forget Du Bois or any of these older people who were so important for our intellectual tradition. And that's where Tom is located.
Absolutely. Speaks to something that was said in the Reader when Tom Dent was talking about the importance of a workshop, and he said one of the things I really tried to express to these young people in this workshop was that you don't just start writing. You've got to know where you've been. You've got to know who the masters were, who came before you, what they said, because only when you know this rich literary tradition that particularly Black writers can offer you, you're not going to know yourself. And so I think when you're saying, yes, it's absolutely necessary to know Tom Dent, that's something that Tom Dent would have probably echoed. He would have probably been too humble to say, know me, but he would have definitely said, know those who came before you, know who laid the foundation that you are building on. We have a question from Liz Granite. I was delighted to learn that Tom preferred writing with a fountain pen to typing. Thanks for that, Lindsay. Could anyone shed light on Tom's creative routines or the daily habits that facilitated his prolific writing career? Thank you.
Tom, this is Kalamu. Tom made a decision, I think it was a conscious decision, that writing was important, not only to him personally, but it's important for New Orleans and for the world. And as such, Tom gave up the opportunity to do many things that he could have done, that he was intellectually equipped to do, physically equipped to do, and what have you. He gave those things up to devote himself to being a writer. And there are not many of us that make a conscious decision about what we will devote our life to. Most of us go through life, and at various stages, things happen to us, and we respond to those things, whether it's meeting someone or being in an accident or getting drafted or whatever it may be, that shapes our lives. But we very seldom make conscious decisions about what we will do with our lives. And when I say our lives, I'm not talking about a particular moment, but rather over the years. So that Tom, when he was robbed, assaulted in New York, and came down to New Orleans, his home, for what he thought was going to be a brief period, he said when he got here, things turned out in such a way that he decided he wanted to stay. And this was the first time that he really, really wanted to stay in New Orleans. He had gone to school in Syracuse. He had gone to in New York. He had gone to school in Atlanta. He had been, as I'm sure Ben can tell you, his family had provided and experiences, life experiences and travel and what have you. But Tom made a decision to live in New Orleans. And because he made that decision as a writer, he decided he would do that work. And so all the time that I knew Tom, he was always working on something. He was always writing. And it was only after, many years after he made his transition, and I'm in the stacks at Amistad working on the book, the Tom Dent Reader, it was then that I discovered just how much work that Tom actually did. And most of his work, it was in two ways. One, by hand with his pen, as Dr. Ward has talked about, and the other, he had a little portable typewriter. And he would work on that typewriter and work on that typewriter and work on that typewriter all the time. And if you knew Tom and were close to him, you knew his typewriter and you knew his pens. That's the best physical description I can give of Tom, his typewriter and his pens.
After Tom made his transition, we found that there were maybe 40 or 50 fountain pens. He collected them. He liked them because of the way they felt and the way they were beautiful and the way they wrote. and he collected them. I do remember the little portable typewriter too. And Tom really liked typewriters, mechanical typewriters, nothing electronic. And I remember one other thing about the way he wrote. When he really had to get something done, like if it was some sort of deadline, he would travel to Galveston, Texas.
That's right. Yeah.
And there was a motel there that he liked, and he would, seclude himself in this hotel where none of his friends knew where he was. Nobody was going to call him. Nobody was going to bother him. All he could do was to write, and that's the way he made himself write. But the collection of materials kind of astounded me. We talk about the writing, including the notebooks and the handwritten stuff, which is amazing, really, to even see part of it. There were also maybe 100 audio cassettes, because he always went around, and when he would talk to people, he would tape it so he could do that, so he could write later. Or he would record music too, like even jazz funerals he would record. And those are kind of harder to access now. I would like to give, we call it a shout out to my brother Walter, who may be watching. I don't know whether he got his computer working or not. He called me while we were on the air, sort of. But Walter gave Amistad a significant amount of money to, catalog Tom's work, and then Amistad went on to make a lot of the stuff available online. I don't have in front of me how to get at it at Amistad, but most of the written materials you can find online because of a donation that my brother Walter gave. Walter gave his money to get Tom's work cataloged, and mine was more frivolous. I gave my money to doing a tennis tournament, and nothing remains of that.
I wouldn't say it was frivolous. I would say it was of a different world.
Right. And I actually, when Ben was speaking, I had no idea there had been a Tom Dent tennis tournament, which I think is really cool because, right, we all honor our people in different ways, right? We've got the Tom Dent lecture series at Dillard. We've got the Tom Dent, I think it's the Tom Dent Festival with the Jazz and Heritage Foundation.
Yes.
They do something with Tom Dent. Yes. And the Tom Dent tennis tournament, right? Like we've got all of these different ways that we pay tribute, which I think are all cool because that really does show you the sort of depth and breadth of the man himself. Yes. And I see that Ever on the Tech, Liz Granite has thrown up a website. There you go. That's where you can find all those digitized Tom Dent archives. Thank you for that, Liz. So, Dr. Ward, when you were talking, I was nodding my head. And y'all, unless you throw a question up in the comments, we're going to end with this one. I feel like this year, Dr. Ward, has been such a correction in my own education, because I have a doctorate degree in English and I was never assigned once in any of my programs, bachelor's, master's, PhD. I was never assigned Tom Dent. And he was mentioned a couple times, but I was never asked to read and think about his work as a young up and coming scholar. It was not a thing. So I feel like having spent the year with this book has really corrected something I didn't even know I was missing until I was so fortunate enough to become the executive director of one book and get to read it and get to design programming around it. So I'm thinking about young folks coming up, whether they're young scholars, just young readers. if they were to say to one of you guys, "Oh, Tom Dent, who's that?" How would you guys answer that question? And I think we'll close out with that. Let's go in reverse alphabetical order this time and start with Dr. Ward.
I would say, would you please go to the Amistad Research Center and read one of Tom's letters, because I want you to sit down and discover the difficulty of reading his handwriting. You have to train yourself to read it. He was, as Tom Phelan said, an artist, even in terms of his penmanship. It's like drawings, not so much like ordinary discursive penmanship. So after that, after you've done that, you should read his work. I mean, that's the only thing you can do. You have to read it, you have to question it, you have to try to relate it to the conditions of now. Tom obviously had nothing to say about pandemics that I remember, but what he was saying about the condition of human beings in this society and elsewhere, because Tom certainly had an interest in what was going on in Africa and several other places in the world. So you use Tom Dent as you use any writer to, as you were saying in a kind of sidewise way, Megan, to retool yourself. We have to undo some of the damage that has been done to us by graduate education, which always said, you specialize on this little box. Never to say, you must understand how this little box is related to other boxes in a universe. There's not a single star in the universe. There are many stars.
I would say to anyone who is confronted with the question, who is Tom Dent, or who confronts the question and presents it to you, that it's not so much who was Tom Dent, but who are you to not know Tom Dent and be brought up in New Orleans. And that bespeaks to how this city is both, we used to say jazz was born here, but it would have died if it stayed here. And we must go beyond our birthing spot and the people we know as a result of growing up. We must go beyond whatever the particulars of our individuality are in order to really find out who we are as individuals. You can't know yourself if you don't know the world into which you were born.
I don't know that I could say more than what has already been said. I honestly don't. I think that really speaks to the variety of different ways that he touched people's lives and the importance of all of his work and his connections and his relationships. I just don't know that I could say more than his friends have said.
I can't think of anything to say either, except to thank Kalamu for putting together it's anthology, is that the right word?
Well, yeah, we could call it an anthology. It's a book, just another book. Yeah.
Well, but it kind of catalogs. It's an anthology with introductions. I'll put it that way. I really appreciate it. And again, thanks to especially Jerry and Kalamu and Megan for selecting the book and doing the things that we've done today to help to preserve his legacy.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much for your time. And I love that idea that you brought up, Dr. Ward, about relating it to the conditions of now. I feel like that came across really nicely in the Ritual Murder production, right? Because they really did bring that into the 21st century, which I thought was so cool. So I'm going to ask a favor of the four of you, and that is when I say bye, please stay backstage so I can say a proper goodbye after closing out the festival. So thank you to Ben Dent, Lindsay Dent, Kalamu Salaam, and Jerry Ward for spending an hour with us remembering Tom Dent. Thank you all.
Thank you for putting the program together.
Yes, thank you, Megan.
And that brings us to the end of Words and Music 2021. It has been a journey. The beauty of the virtual format is this event right here that you just saw. We would not have been able to make this event possible with all of the Dent family from across the country and Dr. Ward and Baba Kalamu here in New Orleans coming together without the beauty of technology. And thinking about the way that we relate it to the conditions of now, the way that we transformed the festival into a virtual platform and brought everyone together, I think was an incredible labor of love and dedication and commitment to checking the links in your inbox. Thank you to everyone who checked your link and showed up backstage on time. Thank you to all the participants. I've got a couple of huge shout outs. Number one is the One Book One New Orleans Board of Directors. We could not do this without you. Also the steering committee for Words and Music. There's a whole committee of guest curators and committee members behind me helping make this magic happen. Candace Huber with Tubby and Coos not only is powering our virtual bookstore, which will be up until Wednesday. So if you missed your chance to buy those books, you've got until Wednesday, and 10% goes to the festival. It'll be up in these comments, but it will also be up at wordsandmusic.org in our links. It's in the homepage. I'm going to be really self-indulgent here, and I'm going to give the biggest shout out of all to my husband, Jermaine Smith, who is not watching because he is taking care of our two young children. We have a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old, and he has held the entire house down while I've held this festival down. So thank you, Jermaine. You're the real MVP. If you see this video, you know you got your shout out. What can I say? Support us if you can. I'll close out with that. wordsandmusicnola@gmail.com. You can PayPal us there, because in the spirit of Tom Dent, who really believed that art should be for all people, this festival virtually was free for the entire community. You've watched it without a paywall of any kind. So if you like what you saw, wordsandmusicnola@gmail.com on PayPal. You can go to your phone, WAM20244321. You can also click those links in the comments section. Also, if you like Words and Music this year and you want to figure out how to be involved next year, we want to hear from you. You can go to wordsandmusic.org and you can hit contact us. You can hit us at Instagram at Words and Music NOLA. You can hit us at Facebook on Words and Music NOLA. Just DM us. We're really responsive. We'll get back to you. And we'd love to see you in New Orleans, hopefully for 2021, when I will hug all my people so hard. I cannot wait to see you all in person again. But thank you all for all the love that you gave us through the comments and the likes and the shares and the shout outs. We really did feel your presence in this little space. Oh, yep. Liz loves Jermaine too, just as much as I do. Thank you guys so much. I have no words of wisdom. I only have gratitude. So thank you all so much for spending 4 days from the comfort of our homes, gathered together in community in order to provide literacy resources for our community and make it stronger. And we look forward to seeing you in 2021. And don't forget also to follow Words and Music and One Book One New Orleans. You're going to see us tomorrow give away 150 books to low-income kids, so look for that. Because even though the festival has ended, the year-long community work never stops. I will see you all around.